Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be building Tamiya's 135th IS-2 model 1944, and I'll be starting off with the building all the way up to the finishing stages. Like most models, the build starts off with the lower chassis and the wheels, so what I always do is after cutting them off the sprue, I use the back of the X-Acto knife and kind of chip backwards to get rid of the parts left by the sprue after cutting it. And I avoid putting too much pressure to avoid creating any flat spots with the X-Acto knife. Then after that I use some of the Squadron sanding sticks, mostly the gray one that says fine on it, just to smoothen it out and make a good round texture on it without any extrusions. What's cool about these wheels is that you can see they have poly caps, which means you can put them on and they'll roll around, and you can paint them while they're on the chassis, but then you can also remove them off of the chassis and weather them individually without having to glue or unglue, so you can kind of just pop them on and off with these poly caps, which is a really nice feature. So you can see here that a lot of the detail is already molded onto the side of the chassis, which is really helpful because it saves a lot of time compared to some other kits like tack-on kits, for which you have to put every detail onto the side of the lower chassis. And here I'm just inserting the suspension attach points, which just pretty much is where the suspension for the road wheel is attached to. A cool feature in this kit is this little jig that you put onto the suspension arms. It makes them dry all level and flat, so you put it on a hard surface. That way you align all the suspension arms, so when you put the road wheels, they all dry flat and touch the track. I put it on a hard surface like just this book, and then put some weighted items like paint cans in it, just to make sure that it's pushed down against the surface and all the suspension arms dry so that they're all aligned properly. So some of the holes for details like the headlights weren't already drilled out, so I just went ahead and used this, it's called the Tamiya electric drill, just to drill out the holes, and I used one of the drill bits from my pin vise to do it. The turret was a pretty simple construction. It was pretty much a three-piece turret: the bottom of the turret, top of the turret, and then the mantlet with the barrel. So it was pretty quick to all put together, and what's nice is that there was some cast texture on the side of the turret. So one addition I bought is, since I don't really like the ropes that Tamiya gives you for the tow cables, I bought these Eureka tow cables on eBay for like $10 or $8, and it comes with some resin hooks and then just a braided copper wire for the tow cables, and you just use some super glue and glue it together, and then you prime it with some metal primer, and then it's ready to be painted. So here I'm priming the model. I'm using a gloss black base. Usually I use flat colors like gray or black, but I ran out of my usual primer, so I was using a gloss black base for this one. So this is actually just the Alclad primer that is used for metallic finishes. So here, after letting the primer dry for at least 24 hours, I'm spraying the base coat of color using Tamiya XF58 Olive Green, and I found out online that this is a pretty good color for the Russian green camouflage, but there's quite a few different colors that you can choose from. So one thing I do when I paint is that I do about a 60-40 mix of Tamiya paint to the acrylic thinner, the X20A1. But it sprays really good like that, but I'd recommend trying out the lacquer thinner actually, because a lot of people say that the lacquer thinner sprays a lot smoother. So I'm probably going to go and buy a bottle of that, and in future models try painting with that to see if it paints smoother and there's like less spatter or anything. For this model, I'm doing the Battle of Berlin Camouflage on this IS-2, so it has a lot of like white stripes that go around the turret, and to do that I masked it off with silly putty and Tamiya tape, and the paint I used was Tamiya XF2 mixed with a few drops of XF57 buff. That way the white color would be toned down a little bit and not be as strong. So after I airbrushed that onto the model and removed the masking tape, I used a brush with diluted white paint to kind of touch up the edges of these stripes to make sure the edges were a little bit sharper. After painting, I give a gloss coat to the model, and after the gloss coat dries for a day or two, I use microset and microsol to help get the decals conform to the texture of the model. So the first thing I do is use a large brush to apply some microset, which is the blue bottle, and this kind of helps me put the decal on and move it around a little bit. So after putting the decal in warm water, I just slide it on, and with a cotton bud or Q-tip, I kind of remove the excess microset. And after that, I use a finer brush to apply the microsol, which is the stronger setting solution, and that's what really gets the decal to conform to the surface. Like on this cast texture, or even on things like Zimmerit, if you apply a good amount of it, it'll like shrivel up the decal and get it to really go into the crevices of the model's texture. So after sealing in the decals with a dull coat, I begin the weathering with chipping. So the chipping color is made up of olive green, which is the base coat, mixed with some white or buff. So as you can see, the chipping color is essentially just a lighter color of the base coat. And I apply it on the sharp edges or edges that would experience wear, and I use like packing foam like I am here, or I just dry brush it onto the spots that I want using a fine paintbrush. So here I'm painting the engine exhausts using a rust color. So this actually isn't a rust color, but it's Humbrol Enamel Leather, number 62 I think. But it really is a good base color for rust weathering. And I like to use enamels because I feel that they don't leave behind any brush strokes. And also I'm going to come back with some oil paints and pigments to kind of give different tones of rust along the exhaust. So here I'm using some oil paint to kind of create some fading on some of the horizontal surfaces of the tank. So this oil paint is Abteilung 502, the olive green, and I just apply it with a brush and kind of scrub it down on the panels that I want to create some fading on, or like color variation. And then I usually use a Q-tip to come and like take away the excess and just really blend it in and make it quite subtle. Here I'm doing an oil dot filter on the vertical surfaces of the tank. I do this to create some color variation as well as some mud and dust weathering on the side surfaces. So I use Abteilung 502 buff and shadow brown oil paint, also with Winsor & Newton Naples yellow, and I just apply it with a fine brush along the top edges of the surface. I then use a wide brush dipped in some Abteilung 502 oil paint thinner. I dry brush most of the thinner off so that the brush only has a very small amount of thinner, and then I just use it to vertically brush down all these dots and get a streaking effect, and that creates some subtle color variation along this panel. I recommend using a smaller amount of thinner because if you use too much, the oil paint, when you streak it downwards, will actually kind of spread out because it'll be overflowed with a bunch of thinner. But if you use a smaller amount of thinner, you can really keep it controlled and then like kind of have more control over the effect and the final result. Here I'm using a similar strategy to before. I'm just using some rust paint that I put under the bolts on the back of the tank, and then use a brush with some oil thinner and then just streak it downwards. Here I'm using some Abteilung 502 oil paints to weather the exhaust I painted earlier. So I start off with a coat of shadow brown oil paint along the exhaust, and then I use some rust colors like rust and patina oxide to kind of brighten it up and put some newer looking rust colors along the exhaust. I also did use a little bit of black along the edges to kind of darken it, and then at the exhaust exit, kind of on the green surface of the tank, I also used some rust colors there. Here I'm doing some streaking on the sides of the turret similar to what I did on the chassis of the tank. So I'm mainly using the Abteilung 502 shadow brown oil paint for this, and I put the dots to start the streaking either along the edge of the turret or under the handrails, and then use a brush with some oil thinner to streak it down. I just streak it multiple times to make the effect subtle, and then I also sometimes have to remove some excess paint that's gotten onto the side of the white areas. So the next part of the weathering is using pigments on the lower part of the tank. So here I'm using Wilder pigments to create my weathering, and I begin by applying the darkest color of pigment along the whole bottom part of the tank. So the darkest pigment I'm using is Wilder's Brown Russian Earth, so I kind of use this as a base coat that goes along the whole lower chassis of the tank. And then I come in with my mid color of pigment, which is Dark European Terrain. And then finally with the brush I use the lightest color in only small parts or small areas, and the lightest color I use is European Road Clay. So here you can see me using the mid color, which is the Dark European Terrain, and then later on you'll see me with the light Road Clay color. I like to put the tank on its side so that none of the pigment slides off, and then use a flat brush, that way I can kind of stipple it easily and stipple large amounts of pigments at once. So after I like how the pigment turns out, I go in and fix it with Wilder's Pigment Fixer. So I actually didn't really like this Pigment Fixer because I felt it was a little bit strong and it kind of ate through my dull coat and even through a little bit of the top coat of paint. So in a couple areas where there was a large amount of fixer, there was a little bit of the black primer that showed through, so I had to go and touch that up with some more pigment. So next time I'm either going to try using Tamiya's X28 thinner, because I've heard that people use that for pigment fixing, or I'll either use a spray bottle and mask off the top of the tank and just spray light mist coats of the fixer instead of dropping large droplets onto it. So now the tracks, they receive the same kind of pigment weathering as the lower chassis did. I just apply the same pigments. Here you can see the bottles in the background, so I apply them with the same brush and everything, and it's kind of a simple routine. And then after that they also get fixed down with the pigment fixer from Wilder. So here I'm using some dirt spatter product to create some speckling around the idler wheel and drive sprocket areas. So the product that I use for this is gray dirt spatter by Wilder, but I think a better option is just to mix your own using some like khaki paint and some water thinner. So I apply this with a brush and a tweezer and kind of just flick the brush along the tweezer, and it flies in tiny speckles along the chassis. So the same thing is done to the wheels, and in the background you can actually see the bottle, which is the product I use. So since the Tamiya IS-2 wheels don't have any rubber around them and it's just bare metal, I used AK steel pigment to create like a metallic surface on it because the paint would wear off and then the underlying metal surface would be exposed. So I just put it on a Q-tip and just keep rubbing at the edges of the wheel, and I eventually get that nice metallic finish. The same pigment's also used on these tow cables, and the tow cables are actually the Eureka ones that I showed earlier in the video. So you can also see some of the stowage. I decided not to film the stowage because it was my first time painting and weathering it, so I didn't really want filming to get in the way of doing it. I just wanted to experiment with some techniques. But pretty much what I did was prime it with some, since it's value gear stowage, so I had to prime it with some resin primer. And then I just painted on the different coats of paint that I wanted, like khaki or olive drab for the stowage. Then weathered it with some oil paints and pigments. For the crates or wooden boxes, I used hairspray and chipped them. So one of the last finishing touches is just applying a little bit of pigment along the sides of the fenders. And then after this, the model is pretty much finished. One quick thing I wanted to point out is that I didn't put all of the external fuel tanks on the fenders. I only wanted to put 2 of them, so I used tinfoil, like you can see here, to create the straps for the fuel tanks. I just cut the tinfoil to the right length and then primed it and painted it. And to make them round, I just put the actual fuel tank in it and kind of like twisted it around and then just glued them in place onto the brackets that come with the kit. This concludes the build for Tamiya's 1/35th scale IS-2. So this was an enjoyable build and it went together really nicely with no issues. The only thing is that there's a little bit of a lack of detail, but with some aftermarket parts the kit can end up looking really nice. I'd really recommend this kit because it's not too hard to build, and there's a lot of aftermarket parts that support Tamiya kits. During this build I got to experiment with some new techniques, most importantly the stowage. The stowage was really nice and I got to practice painting and weathering stowage, which is something I haven't done before. So I hope everyone enjoyed this video or learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one. Lastly, I wish everyone a Merry Christmas.